we have to attend to the transformational potential of psychedelics when used in hands that have good healing intentions and in hands that may have other intentions, including ignorance.
I can't help but ask, is psychedelic-assisted conversion therapy actually something that would work?
Psychedelics are particularly powerful because they are non-specific amplifiers of set and setting.
How is it possible that psychedelics would be used to help suppress people or disconnect people from themselves? Welcome back to the Webdelics podcast. We have with us in the house today, Alex Belser. We are going to be focusing right now on the LGBTQ community and the psychedelics renaissance, the history of the relationship between the two, special considerations for that community, and what the future might look like. Alex, welcome to the show.
Scott, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
It is truly a pleasure to have you here, and I'm really excited about this discussion. We have talked about the relationship of the psychedelics renaissance with a whole host of other historically marginalized groups: African Americans, older people, people with terminal illnesses, women, but we've never actually focused on a community that is perhaps, particularly when it comes to the trans community, one that's facing a lot of scrutiny, and that may, due to a lot of the trauma that people face growing up or even in their adult lives, potentially benefit from psychedelic use as much, if not more than anyone. You've devoted a lot of your practice to that community. Talk to us a little bit about how and why you think the psychedelics renaissance could help this particular segment of the population out.
Sure, absolutely. Look, we live in a difficult time right now for so many people for so many reasons. One of the things that has been coming back with a vengeance is something that we call conversion therapy. And that means, and this was the norm, not just in psychedelics, but in psychology, psychiatry, medicine for most of the 20th century, which is that gay people like me, like I was a gay little boy, we were told that we were sick. There was something wrong with us, something really deeply wrong, that we might go to hell, or that we were psychologically, wrong in some way. And that the thing to do to treat you was to make you straight. And that was an explicit goal of so many founding parents, fathers, mothers in the psychedelic movement. And it's coming back today because the U.S. Supreme Court is has accepted a case from the state of Colorado where they have now legal psychedelic use in some ways. And in the Colorado case would allow for therapists, counselors to use conversion therapy, including potentially psychedelic conversion therapy like ketamine therapy, on young people, on adolescents who come out. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, his wife, owns a counseling center that compares homosexuality to bestiality and seems to potentially specifically practice conversion therapy. And so there's a lot of dark history, rainbow skeletons in the closet that we could talk about. And there's also a lot of beauty, because in the recent book, Queering Psychedelics, we had an anthology of 42 different queer authors who have not only survived the closet as queer and trans folks, but have so much to offer the community of psychedelic researchers and clinicians and people, gay and straight, cisgender and transgender, and writing beautifully about how those two cultures intersect and the special lineage that queer people who are often at the margins, not in the square middle, have held, holding the torch of psychedelic practice and clinical work in outsider status, not just in our culture, but in many, many cultures.
Before we dive into some of that history and some of the positive possibilities for those within the LGBTQ community, let's step back and address something that you said that I am sure 99.9% of the people watching or listening to the show were utterly unaware of, which is the possibility of psychedelics being used within a conversion therapy context. The guests who have appeared on this show so far, as well as those your homeboy Scott here has happened to have met just in day-to-day life, overwhelmingly share psychedelic usage as part of the coming of age of their sense of connection with other people, connecting them to their purpose, feeling more spiritually alive, feeling more comfortable with who and what their future might be as themselves. As an episode with Mark McNally, one of the earliest episodes recorded of this show, went into a brief digression about one of the beautiful things that psychedelics can open people to is, he said something like, dyeing your hair pink and coming out of the closet and really living the way you want to live. With that mentality in place, how is it possible that psychedelics would be used to help suppress people or disconnect people from themselves? How can that tension be conceivably resolved? How does this even make sense? I guess I'm just not calculating things in my mind. Something I'm missing.
I think, speaking right to the heart of the crux of the matter, and I'll try to address your question, which is that there is an idea, a thread in the psychedelic world, that psychedelics are all good. And that if we just listen, they will ennoble us and help us heal and grow spiritually and as human beings. And maybe there is truth to that. But we know, not just with LGBTQ plus people, we know that psychedelics were used harmfully by MK Ultra and the British and Russian militaries. We know, for mind control and torture. We know that they were used in bad ways with BIPOC folks in the 20th century. We know that Charles Manson, and his group, had used LSD as part of their rituals. We know that there were recent scholarship on psychedelics being a big part of extreme right-wing, fascist, racist groups, for example. And so I think that we have to attend to the transformational potential of psychedelics when used in hands that have good healing intentions and in hands that may have other intentions, including ignorance. I mean, so for example, in the world, I'm a psychologist, I have a PhD in psychology. In this world, it was seen as a mental illness. Homosexuality was in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual as a pathology until 1973, and even long after that, it was normal for people to feel like the thing to do would be to help these poor gay people not die by suicide and live a miserable, lonely life. And I have a colleague in the psychedelic world who underwent 2 conversion therapies and was told, if you don't have satisfying sexual relations in a relationship with a woman, you're going to be miserable for the rest of your life. And that's the course. Psychedelics are particularly powerful because they are non-specific amplifiers of set and setting. And if the setting of a clinic is implicitly homophobic or transphobic, if the setting of the clinic intentionally wants to break down the disordered psyche, ego death and ego dissolution, if we dissolve the psyche, dissolve the ego down, maybe that leads to liberation. But it is also a means to manipulate a person who has their own sense of self built up, break it down, and then reshape it while they're hyper-suggestible into a new mold that would be more socially conforming or acceptable or, wanted by coercive power structures, whether it's in the culture or in the law or in the family or in the religious system. And psychedelics are great at that. They're really powerful at that. And not only that, but internalized homophobia is so powerful that in the past, many queer people sought out therapy to help them become straight. I know that I did. My first coming out was to my therapist when I was a student at Georgetown. I was really hoping that she'd help me not be gay. And I think that that's a common normative thing for a lot of people initially who come out. And I think there's a lot of people who really feel that, like, when they go, that they're living a life of sin, and that they want to stop because they were told that having sex with the same-sex partner was sin, and that they worry. Even gay men in their 40s and 50s that are dear friends of mine, they worry. They're like, yeah, I'm out. They're married to their partner. They're out and proud and dance at during Pride, but they worry that when they die and they go up to the heavenly pearly gates, they're worried they're going to be rejected and get the down button arrow. And so, they seek out treatment and say, can you help me? And that's actually what happened in the psychedelic community, which is that this was a very popular program of internalized self-hatred that both clinicians and patients sought out and enacted over and over again.
Hearing all of that, I can't help but ponder the following. Guest after guest on this show have said the experience that you have on a facilitated psychedelic or plant medicine journey is a step, but it doesn't necessarily, in fact, it probably will not lead to change unless you do integration work at a minimum, but continue to do some sort of self-improvement or spiritual development or other internal growth work in the aftermath, therapy, other things like that. And so with those words in mind, I can't help but ask, is psychedelic assisted conversion therapy actually something that would work? It's a painful question to ask, and I feel a little bit politically incorrect asking it, but I know I cannot be the only person who's asking that, because if you are doing this sort of psychedelic experience as part of a longer conversion therapy process, is there evidence that the changes that you might be seeking in this take hold? If not, why then would any other sort of psychedelic experience that you have followed up by additional internal work succeed? You know what I'm saying? In a way, if we're saying that that conversion therapy, supportive psychedelic experiences might not be able to take hold, then in a way it's questioning whether any sort of psychedelic experience really has a transformative power and can take true hold in our lives.
Yeah, I love working. I like working with everybody I work with in my private practice and all this clinical psychedelic trials I've been a part of over the last 20 years. We started in 2005 at NYU. It depends on what you mean by could it work? Might it work? Could psychedelic therapy work? The answer is yes and no. If your goal by what works, meaning can we get this person to stop having sex with or romantic partnerships with people of their own gender and like play straight or play cisgender for a while, maybe the rest of their lives, the answer is yes, of course it could work. That happens all the time. That's already successful. And in fact, the leaders in the psychedelic field said that's exactly what it did. Tim Leary said LSD, quote, LSD is a specific cure for homosexuality. Richard Alpert, Ram Dass, published 2 papers in the peer-reviewed literature as evidence that, yes, his psychedelic therapy with psilocybin treating gay men worked to convert them into straight men who had satisfying sexual relationships with women. Masterson Houston, who wrote The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, one of the most influential books of the 20th century, said that mescaline leads towards heterosexualization. Hollywood Hospital had an LGBTQ psychedelic conversion therapy program. This is the most famous psychedelic treatment center in the world that treated people like Cary Grant. We have centers in France and the UK and Canada and the United States and and Australia, around the world, doing this, saying it worked. I believe it could work again. And that's what, Christian counseling centers said it works, and psychoanalytic programs in the decades ago and today still said it did work. Now, the answer is also, did it work? No. If you mean by did it work, did it help a person deeply heal the roots of their trauma and their developmental traumas and grow into a more full person with greater autonomy, agency, self-love, compassion for others, and good fellowship in the world? The answer is, I don't think there's no evidence that it would do that.
So what I am taking away from this is that the quote unquote desired outcome of those who would seek to encourage others to use psychedelic assisted conversion therapy, or those who might seek to use psychedelic conversion therapy to shift their own sexual orientation or gender body match, might actually work, but it's not something that resolves the underlying trauma that growing up in that situation would have brought them to and would have caused them to seek such therapy in the first place. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, like, so for example, I work with closeted men in Utah who are in the Church of Latter-day Saints Mormons who call me because I'm a gay New York public figure to do therapy. Or in my case, I'm practicing, sort of like consultation with them, and they'll say things to me like, yeah, it does work. I'm seeing a therapist here, and they treat it like an addiction, and they say like, you're in abstinence from going out to the gay bar and trying to pick up, trying to make connections with other men. I do want to say that this is not an archaic matter. I mean, this is not history. It's alive and well today. There's still a male and a female dyad written into the investigational brochure of USONA, one of the largest nonprofits, that they presented to the FDA, saying that, in the therapy room, the two clinicians should be a man and a woman, which is highly stereotypes gender roles, and it comes with a whole lot of baggage around like what men and women can and should be able to do. Jacques Mabit, who's maybe the most famous ayahuasquero in the world, who runs a huge ayahuasca center in Central America, Latin America, we have a published interview with him where he says very clearly that ayahuasca does help, at least how he uses it, help people. I'm going to paraphrase, but he basically argues that homosexuality is a degraded spiritual position and that ayahuasca will help you transcend it. Stan Grof, MAPS just put out a statement 3 days ago, a second public letter from Dr. Stan Grof, who's known as the godfather of LSD, who's still alive. And when as a personal hero of mine, when I was 17, I read his book, LSD Psychotherapy. It changed my life. It turned me on to all of this. I feel immensely grateful for so much of the beautiful work he's done in his life. But his book also said, and I read that as a little closeted gay boy, I didn't come out for another couple years, that in the transpersonal psychology realm, that the reason why gay people are gay is that they have, quote, an unfinished gestalt from a previous life incarnation. What he meant by that was, transpersonally, I was a woman in a past life, he would argue, and that I had an unfinished business in that life, and that my growing into a gay person in this life is a sort of transpersonal sickness that needs to be overcome and healed in this life to undo the bad work from the unfinished business from the previous incarnation. And now he's written 2 letters of apology and for how he's written about this, and for republishing this even into 2009, where he calls homosexuality a sexual deviation and Grof writes extensively about treating people who are gay in ways that help them to have heterosexual relationships, which he counts as good outcomes. He vehemently denies that he's practiced conversion therapy, and I think I would encourage people to read our open letter to him, for example, and ask them to make up their own minds about it. I wish Dr. Grof all the best health in the world, and I have sincere appreciation for his work, but our focus is on the institutional legacy of this in the psychedelic world. Why aren't we talking about this in the same breath with MK Ultra? Why hasn't there been a reckoning? And I think that we can do this. Like, we can do this because there are gay and trans kids like today that are being exposed to this. 16,000 people a year, gay and trans kids. And with a Supreme Court case coming up, 28 states that ban conversion therapy will have their laws overturned if that goes through the Supreme Court. And it looks like it might.
This all really speaks personally to me. When you mentioned earlier that the underlying trauma that led people, or that may have led their parents, to seek conversion therapy is not addressed during the process of conversion therapy, or at least it's not the focus. The focus is more, as the name of the therapy suggests, on changing behavior rather than healing what might have led to that. I can't help but think of the church that I grew up in, which was a fundamentalist Christian church in the Midwest, where the minister regularly did stand up on the pulpit and talk about how gay people were going to hell, went on and on about Sodom and Gomorrah. He had the young people come down to the altar and bow their heads, and he touched each of them on the top of their head and blessed them away from ever having an abortion, ever having sex before marriage, and ever being gay or lesbian. Later, when I went to college, and it, by the way, hearing that sort of thing over and over in church, it really did land. I mean, I still viscerally remember the messaging from that to this day by virtue of the fact that I'm able to describe it so vividly with you. When I was in college, there was a friend of mine whose parents, on religious grounds, rejected her for being lesbian. And they pushed hard about her, what they believed to be a lifestyle choice. They were able to successfully instill within this young woman a lot of guilt. And one of the saddest times of my entire college experience was when I found out that in response, she had put herself in a car and turned on the gas inside a closed garage and ended her life. I still think about her to this day. So what you're talking about is true. These traumas, they're real. Hearing the history of psychedelics with regards to a community that is already vulnerable, and how people may be seeking ways that have been medically discredited to address some of the choices that such individuals might be making, has me asking myself, why would any LGBTQ person come anywhere near a psychedelics practitioner or touch these substances at all? How could anyone conceivably say that these are a healthy way to deal with the traumas that they have? Is there anything else besides these that people might want to use at all costs to avoid psychedelics? What is your response to that, especially as someone who has, as implicit in this entire discussion, committed a large part of your life work to exactly working with this community vis-a-vis these substances?
Oh, I love working as a clinician with people doing, I do a group practice. We call it Ketamine Assisted Psychotherapy for queer folks, CAP for queer folks. And it's an affinity group of queer people. We get together and we, do a legal practice with preparation and integration as a group, with a focus on what it's like to be LGBTQ plus in our histories, in our families, in our relationships, in our world, in the community itself, and with one another. And it is so exquisitely beautiful. It can be really gorgeous. Psychedelics are not obviously just for any one people. They never have been, and they never will be. And to the extent that the closet gets built up around gay kids, board by board, plank by plank, by principals and teachers and ministers and coaches and parents, we make those kids like deconstruct their own closets board by board. And psychedelics sometimes blow that blow that house down. And I mean that sincerely. There's many articles about psychedelics in the book Queerness, Psychedelics, where people talk about self-acceptance and psychedelics, how taking psychedelics helps them to know themselves, to love themselves, and to accept and even celebrate themselves. That's what pride really means, right? It's like deep love, self-love, which is the antidote to self-hate and shame that we were taught. And psychedelics encourage us, I think, when used well, to connect and not to self-isolate and to burrow deep within ourselves, into our own, even when we're among people, to be bottled up inside. And I would argue that we have a lot of evidence that oftentimes the shaman at the edge of the village, the medicine person, woman, wise man at the end of the road in villages, who is not quite in the town square, but those people disproportionately seem to be not entirely of this conventional gender or sexual identities. So there's a long history of queer people being in anthropology and cultural spaces, and even in today's psychedelic world, like taking positions of leadership as medicine people. And I see that in the therapy space. Like there's a superabundance of queer people who are wonderful psychotherapists and physicians and doctors and nurses. And I think psychedelics have the potential to heal. And when used with good intention, even in a setting that can be implicitly homophobic, like a Santo Daime or a UDV ritual where everybody has to be broken up, sorted top down by gender, girls on the left, boys on the right, just like in elementary school where like you learned that you had to go to the girls' bathroom in the girls' line or the boys' bathroom in the boys' line, and suddenly everyone in the room splits in two, like the first time you're really cut off and grouped from a top-down way. We see that in ayahuasca circles all the time. And, boys have to wear pants, girls have to wear skirts, girls have to have their hair long, boys have to have their hair short. And so, but the psychedelic call to self-knowing, the way that it does illuminate that, can be a liberatory practice. And so when we say integration, the question is, what are we integrating? Are we integrating ourselves into our world, into ourselves, or ourselves into the world? And is it the world as it is, or the world that we want to make together? And if you're integrating yourself into homophobic, transphobic, repressed, capitalist, colonized society, the question is, how can we do that differently? Like, I don't want to integrate into that. I want to integrate together to build with you something more beautiful and loving. And I've seen that we can do that. It happens, even now.
Although I have to say, on the subject of genderization, when discourse comes up, particularly with regards to substances like ayahuasca or San Pedro, there does seem to be this idea that some substances tap into the feminine, some tap into the masculine. And I have to ask if these substances, which are some of the most discussed ones out there, they are some of the ones that are most used, particularly if you leave the United States. Ayahuasca in particular comes up all the time. Ayahuasca retreats, or I was in Peru, or I was in somewhere else in South America, and I went on this thing, and I went back and I had this experience, and all that sort of stuff. So you hear about it a lot. If you are, say, trans, and you really feel like the biology that you were born with doesn't fit into any of these pre-established identities tied into the particular substances that you might encounter, or if you are gender fluid or gender non-binary, or if you're cisgender, but there's still a part of you that really relates to the gender that might not be how you are presenting on the outside, that there could be some sort of through the psychedelic experience that's genderized this way, another experience that you're having of being outside, even in the space of a substance or substances that are supposed to be healing. Am I loopy wondering about this?
No, I think some people make a very forceful argument, and I'm not even opposed to this argument that I'll try to represent it as best. You did a good job, but just to summarize, some people say that certain medicines call forth sacred masculine or sacred feminine aspects, which are beautiful and should be honored, and that there are ways to recognize that comes through the medicine or through the practice that we put together. And I think that can be beautiful. But what I don't agree with is that the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine can only be owned by women and men exclusively. And that I see this all the time. I see women in positions of leadership in circles who have many of the aspects of what we might call instead sacred lunar and solar practices, feminine and masculine practices, who are caring and nurturing, but also, when need be, powerful, protective, strong, analytical. And I see as a look, I'm a pretty butch therapist guy. Like, people perceive me as a straight guy. I'm seen as a cisgender man. But in my practice, yes, I can be authoritative and even dominant and confident. But I can also be caring and vulnerable and soft and gentle and receptive. All the yin to the yang. And so this idea that gender essentialization, which uses highly sensitive, stereotype gender roles, that the male therapist in the room is projected onto as the father and has sacred masculinity energy, and the woman therapist in the room is the sacred mother and is there to represent sacred motherly and womanly energy, is so deeply baked into generations of highly stereotyped gender practices in American and world culture, that I think it would do all of us, not just trans and gender expansive folks or cis queer folks, but straight folks too. It does a great disservice to straight men. It does a great disservice to straight women, cisgender men and women, and we don't have to do it that way.
If I am someone who is really struggling with basically post-traumatic stress from my childhood due to being bullied over being trans or LGBT or otherwise outside of gender behavioral or presentation norms, or if I am someone who is looking to more deeply integrate my whole self into who and what I am becoming in my life, including maybe more deeply embracing something that I previously have merely accepted or maybe have felt a sort of reactive pride about. What impact can a carefully facilitated, with the right set and setting, as you mentioned earlier, psychedelic treatment end up meaning for me? Like, are there some stories that you have, or can you give us some sort of sense as to what this might, how this might be able to change my relationship to myself as a LGBTQ or other gender non-conforming sort of person?
I worked to help prevent suicide in gay kids. There were a lot of college freshmen, the year I went into my grad school program, who were jumping off the GW Bridge and dying because of a history of harassment. And, it breaks my heart. It broke my heart. And I identified with that because I was one of those kids. I grew up in a very conservative Indiana suburb where there were 3,000 people in my school. Not one administrator, staff member, not one student was out of the closet. Everybody was closeted. And when I talked with a young man who had a lot of shame about his body, which is something that you're taught when you're gay. And he was in an ayahuasca circle, and he said, I was in this one room with that was a good room in many ways, but I didn't feel fully like I could be my whole self. I just had to sort of show up. And maybe people could ask me if I was gay, but I never offered it, and I never really talked about it, and it's not the most important part of me anyway, so I just, it never came up. People just assumed I was straight. But, it's a 6 or 7 hour ceremony, and he's lying down in the dark by candlelight or very low light, and he can lie down on his back, and he can sit up on his back jack, but he for a time he wanted to lay down on his stomach just kind of to pray and to just to lie down, and he realized as soon as he did that his butt was in the air, and he said, I just felt like I had this whole trip imagining that the room thought that it was so like seductive and preposterous that the gay guy came in and showed his butt to the room, even though he's just lying down on his mat. And I'm sure other people are rolling around in all sorts of ways on their mat. They can lie on their stomach all the time, all they want. He couldn't do it. He had to turn around. He felt like he couldn't share that this part of his body, which was vilified. I mean, for men, butts are always vilified. They're definitely not places to play with. They're definitely not things to explore, whether you're straight or gay. They're taboo in many ways, but specifically as a gay man, it was a part of him that he was like, this is not welcome in this circle. And he went back to a different circle and had that whole trip all over again, except this time, instead of like looping through that PTSD loop around it, he came out of that loop because he was able to see deeply through the help of the medicine just how screwed up that programming had been, that how it had taught him, how he had learned to hate his butt and his body and how he looked and how he talked and how he was, and that he could unlearn it, and that in fact, like, we're not carved into rock, and we're fluid growing organisms that are hallucinating here together, and he had a lot of healing around that. It was really quite beautiful to hear.
Alex, there is a stereotype that I cannot be the only person in the planet who has ever held this, that gay men, in particular gay cisgender men, are successful, they don't have children, they live in glamorous houses in fabulous cities and hang out in Fire Island. And lesbians, there is even some data around this. I don't know to what extent this data is accurate or not, but lesbians even you see in positions of power and authority, and there's this quote-unquote lesbian premium I've been told about that is an income increase that certain women have that is associated with their sexual orientation. They don't have children, and so they are seen as perhaps people that could easily, if you were to believe this stereotype and accept it as true, they would be people that would have access to a lot of these treatments, which right now are not necessarily accessible to everyone. Yet, again, I'm going to go personal here. I used to work for a homeless services department, and during the dead of the winter every year, I think it was in February, it was always one of the coldest nights of the year, we would do a survey of street homeless people. And one of the things that struck me about doing those surveys is you would come across usually young people, and you would ask anyone that you met on the street, whether they were wearing a fur coat or whether they were sleeping on a sidewalk vent, do you have a home? And so often the young people that were well-dressed, not necessarily sleeping on a vent to stay warm or hiding in a subway station, would say yes. And when we would ask for a little bit more information from them, or if we would engage in conversations with them, it would be revealed that they were trans, usually implicitly kicked out of the house, doing what they could to survive in a world that was tough. And those folks are traumatized. They're traumatized. There's no way they can't be having experienced that sort of thing. And even if you are not in that particular situation, if you are someone who is LGBTQ or any other marginalized group for that matter, and you suffer the social or professional consequences that can come with that, stereotypes notwithstanding, you don't have access. As the psychedelic renaissance steps forward, as people within the LGBTQ community understand and unlock its potential in terms of dealing with their own consequences, how do we ensure that the folks that I'm talking about don't get left behind? Because they need it more than anybody.
First of all, I just want to recognize my positionality as a white. I have so many levels of intersecting privilege. I'm a white, cisgender, straight-passing man who has a certain presentation, and I have a formal degree, and I have had many, many, many access points. And some of the things I've been through are not seen.
Yeah.
But I have, and I think you spoke to this in the beginning, there are certain ways in which gay couples, lesbian couples have certain potential forms of privilege because they don't have the extra cost of raising kids as often, although that's changing slightly.
Yeah.
But when you look at the data, LGBTQ populations, and especially, as you put it, trans and gender expansive folks, look, they have 3 times the level of problematic alcohol use, 3 times the level of depression, multiple times the level of PTSD, multiple times the level of anxiety, multiple times the level of alcoholism. Like, this is not because they're sicker, and statistically, when you do real research looking at mediators, it's not because they're gay that they're sick or they're trans that they're sick. It's because they're gay and trans, and it's linked to social stigmatization, experiences of bullying, experiences of family rejection, experiences of being kicked out of their homes, experiences of that lead to internalized shame processes. This is called minority stress. And that is what leads to all these bad outcomes, like all these coping mechanisms, like becoming depressed or taking drugs in a way that's problematic, that they have much worse outcomes than their straight cisgender peers. That being said, the question of money and access, like, we have got to figure out a way to make this more accessible. And if we fit psychedelics into the current healthcare mold, it will go the way that everything goes, which is profit maximalization for a few companies, with an IP moat. And, there'll be tens of millions of people who don't have access to that particular treatment because they're either uninsured or they're underinsured, or they have gaps in insurance, for example, or it ends up being pay out of pocket and they can't afford it. This is a known problem. What I think this solution is, and there's like little things we can do today, like we run a sliding scale in our group cap for queer folks, right? And the scale goes up and down. We have like a basic cost, but if you have more, we ask you to pay more, and if you have less, you pay less. And that's one way that many psychedelic and ketamine clinics try to be more fair. I'm part of a community that has not a FLOF policy, a radical fairy world, where we have no one turned away for lack of funds. Some people have more, some people don't have anything. They can give in other ways, but they don't have coin. Mm-hmm. And that's a consensus-based model that doesn't really fit into the architecture of our economy, but can and does exist and succeeds and even thrives. And the last thing I'll say is, what can we do to decentralize the means of production of psychedelic medicine, plants, ownership of intellectual property, ownership of who owns the clinics? Like, do we really need a McDonald's franchise of clinics, like, owned by like one man who or a franchise that has like 1,000 psychedelic clinics across the land? No. Why can't we have mom and pop style, locally owned, locally sourced medicine that where the employees there actually have an ownership stake in the company and aren't just like there on some sort of this happens all the time, a lot of social workers, counselors, psychologists in training get into predatory relationships where they have to work under someone's license, or they basically get paid like a lower rate and then everything else gets skimmed off the top so they can work in a clinic. We need to have people who own what they're doing. This happens in ayahuasca centers all the time. There's these big resort centers, and they hire out ayahuasqueros from the indigenous communities, the Shipibo people, and they charge the clients, $5,000 a head, and then they pay the indigenous person $70 for the night. Like, this is like happening all the time right now, but it does not have to. And what I've seen is, I'll just say lastly, as a sort of end note that I've been excited by, like, in a world. Look, we're 50 years into the drug war. Like, psychedelics have been illegal for my entire lifetime. They may be for some time yet. Even if MDMA and psilocybin are legalized, it's probably only going to be legalized, specific medical grade, prescribable psilocybin. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to just take MDMA or psilocybin in your home. Mm-hmm. So in the naturalistic underground settings, what I've seen is not just churches, but meaningfully self-organizing circles of queer folks, straight folks that come together, that apprentice with one another to learn how to facilitate and serve medicine to one another at low or no cost, as a form of building bonds of community, of having meaningful work and practice, and of offering something of merit in their world and in their spiritual life. And those sorts of decentralized, locally managed, self-organizing circles, like AA chapters, right? Like nobody really runs AA. Like it's all volunteer run out of love. That model is already happening, and is, like, the vast number of people who take psychedelics today are taking them not in the clinic. They're taking them in other settings. Mm-hmm. The question is, can we do that? Can we do that with more integrity? Can we do that with safer boundaries? Can we do that in a more sacred container? And the answer is, we know that we can, and we should. We will.
This has been a really emotional, deep, and on your end, Alex, honest and raw conversation. I thank you so much for that. If there is something that I will remember long after our chat is over, it likely will be the importance of really thinking about the intent, and perhaps intentionally inquiring about the intent of those who you work with, particularly if they are people who you're entrusting the healing of trauma associated with something that has kept you on the outskirts of society. What are their real beliefs about what caused you to be an outsider, to not fit in, or to be marginalized? What are the outcomes that they will drive you to? What will the implications be for your life? It's more than we might have touched on before on this podcast around making sure that they have the appropriate experience, that they are someone who is asking about your health. It's really seeking, depending on your language, a psychographic or an emotional or a spiritual or a philosophical match to ensure that your needs are addressed with the appropriate care. And if there's amplification going on, it's an amplification that really is going to enable you to live your best life. Alex, if there is anything that you would like us to take away from all that you shared, or if there's something that you didn't get a chance to say that you feel is important for us to hear, what might that be?
Honestly, what's coming up for me, Scott, is not just how animated and caring you are, but like I really felt your curiosity. Like you really wanted to hear what I had to say about this. Yes. And I've talked about this many times, but you are eliciting like you're helping me lean into being a little bit more vulnerable about my own story and how it's affected me. And that lets me speak more from the heart and less from my old brain. So thank you for making the space to listen really deeply. And I felt that from you.
What an incredible thing to hear. And Alex, anyone who has watched this or listened to it will get a sense as to exactly how huge your heart is. Alex, anyone who has experienced this discussion will no doubt, in addition to everything that we've said so far, want to learn more about you. Where can they go to find out more about you? What are the books that you've been involved in? What do you have going on?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, I co-edited an anthology called Queering Psychedelics, From Oppression to Liberation in Psychedelic Medicine. You can buy it anywhere books are sold, at least online. I also recently came up with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Bill Brennan, with Embark Psychedelic Therapy. The book is out from Oxford University Press this year. It's called Embark Psychedelic Therapy for Depression, a new approach for the whole person. And it's gotten some nice write-ups and reviews. And if you're a clinician or a person who's just really interested in psychedelic therapy, the whole how to do it, what happens in it, we really write extensively about that. It's not LGBTQ focused, but it brings in sociocultural themes and the real like clinical guidebook aspect of like how to do that. And that includes a free online 14-hour training that anybody can register for. It's embarkapproach.com with some of the best psychedelic faculty in the world. And lastly, if you're interested in me or my practice, my website is alexbelser.com, and you can find me under Alex Belser at like Instagram and things like that. So nice talking with you.
It has been amazing. And all of that information, in case you just didn't happen to have a pen available to write it down on the spot, is in both the show notes and the caption beneath the YouTube video. And it has truly been an honor and an eye-opener speaking to you, Alex.
Thanks for having me on, Scott.
Thank you. For those of you who enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite audio platform or on YouTube. And if you have listened to this on Spotify or Apple or another audio channel, please leave a 5-star review for us. We want to hear your feedback. If you are watching this on YouTube, for heaven's sake, leave a comment below the video. Also, make sure that you subscribe to each of our social channels. We have amazing content in addition to snippets from the show there. And then once you've done all of that, go to the Webdelics website at webdelics.com. Sign up to our newsletter. Oh, and be sure to check out our top 100 psychedelic thought leaders, etc. You will see Alex there as well, but he deserves to be celebrated, and we therefore celebrated him. And above all else, come back next time for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.